Vivienne Okafor Wade was 40 years old the morning her grandmother's estate attorney read the will aloud in a conference room in Richmond, Virginia, and her husband laughed. She was wearing the same black dress she had worn to the funeral 3 days prior. Pressed, modest, unremarkable. She carried a canvas tote that held a legal pad and her grandmother's obituary, which she had written herself the week before, and which contained, in its restrained and careful phrasing, more of her grandmother's actual life than anyone in the room fully understood. Her husband, Desmond Wade, sat beside her in a well-cut blazer he had worn specifically for the occasion, because Desmond understood the social value of appearance in ways that ran considerably deeper than his understanding of most other things. The attorney read the primary bequests. Property to the church. The jewelry divided among the cousins. The savings account, modest, consistent with what everyone expected of a woman who had spent her life appearing to live simply, to be dissolved and distributed to 3 charitable organizations her grandmother had supported for decades. And then the attorney said, "To my granddaughter, Vivienne Annette Okafor Wade, I leave the sum of $1. Desmond Wade laughed. It was not a long laugh. It was the specific laugh of a man who has been waiting for a number and received an insult instead, and who cannot help letting his relief at not being further obligated express itself as contempt. $1. What Desmond did not know, what no one in that room knew except for the attorney and Vivienne herself, was that the $1 was not the inheritance. The $1 was the key. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The late afternoon light came into the kitchen of the house Vivienne shared with Desmond in the Churchill neighborhood of Richmond, at an angle that had always made her think of her grandmother's kitchen in Danville, 45 minutes south. The same quality of amber light, the same hour of day, the same particular stillness that comes into a house when the work of the day is temporarily paused and the evening has not yet begun. She was standing at the counter doing the one thing she did every evening without exception, regardless of what the day had held. She was writing in the household ledger. Not a digital record, a physical book, bound in navy cloth, the kind that had been sold in office supply stores for decades, and that Vivienne had used since she was 22 years old, and her grandmother had placed the first one in her hands and said, "Write everything down. The ones who keep the records are the ones who keep the truth." Her grandmother, Ida Lucille Okafor, had been a woman of such careful and consistent understatement that the people who knew her casually had never come close to knowing her at all. She had kept house for a family in Danville for 20 years, then cleaned office buildings for another 12, and had lived in the same modest home on a quiet street for 51 years, and had worn the same style of cotton house dress every day of Vivienne's childhood, and had smelled of lavender and floor wax, and the particular industry of a woman who never stopped moving. She had not appeared, by any measure visible to the outside world, to be a woman of extraordinary means. She had told Vivienne once, when Vivienne was perhaps 9 or 10 and sitting at her kitchen table doing homework while Ida moved through her evening routines, "A woman who makes herself small is not a woman who thinks small." Remember the difference. Vivienne had remembered. She had met Desmond Wade at a professional conference in Washington 8 years prior. He was a financial advisor, fluent, charming, handsomely put together, with the easy assurance of a man whose confidence had rarely been seriously challenged. He spoke about money with a facility she had initially found appealing, and he had pursued her with what she had taken for intention, and what she now understood had been calculation. He had been married to her for 6 years. He had been content with her for perhaps 3 of them. The shift had come the way these things always come, not in a single moment, but across a series of them, each individually explicable, collectively forming a pattern she had traced many times in the ledger and chosen, for reasons she did not explain even to herself, not to act on until the time was correct. On the kitchen counter, beside the ledger, was a small clay dish Vivienne had made herself at a ceramics class she had taken the previous winter, an irregular oval in the particular shade of terracotta that had always reminded her of the Danville soil, glazed in a way that caught the light differently depending on the angle. She had made it for no purpose beyond the making of it, and she kept it by the stove and used it to hold the spare key. That spare key was not the house key. It was a safe deposit box key from a bank branch on Broad Street, and it had been given to her by her grandmother 18 months before the funeral, with the specific instruction that she was not to use it until the estate reading was concluded. She had not used it. She had kept it in the clay dish and said nothing about it to anyone. It would matter. Desmond had changed in the way that men change when they decide, without articulating it even to themselves, that they have been patient long enough with a life they consider insufficient. His standards for Vivienne had become visible in small ways: a comment about the house, a remark about her dress, an impatience with her quietness that she recognized as the frustration of a man who had expected a certain kind of reflected status and found instead a woman who simply did not perform it. He had begun, in the previous year, to spend more time away from home than his schedule required. He had begun to be vague about the specifics of his time in ways that were new. She had noted all of it. She had not acted. She had written it in the ledger and continued with her evenings and waited for the correct time. The signal came 2 months before the funeral, in the form of a document she found entirely by accident. She was looking for their household insurance renewal paperwork in the file cabinet in his study, a task she performed annually, in the same week, with his full knowledge and without objection. She found the insurance document. She also found, in a folder behind it, labeled simply with a number she did not recognize, a draft prenuptial agreement that had never been executed. It was dated 14 months into their marriage. It named, as the primary financial interest to be protected, an investment account she had never been told existed, in Desmond's name only, with a current value at the time of drafting of just under $900,000. She had not known about that account. She photographed the document in the same flat, methodical way she photographed property records and insurance policies: front page, signature block, schedule of assets, the date in the upper right corner. She returned the folder to its precise position. She closed the cabinet. She went back to the kitchen and finished the evening routines and made dinner and asked Desmond about his day when he came home and listened to the answer. Her hands had not shaken. Her face had remained perfectly calm. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. She spent the following 3 evenings reviewing the household finances with the focused attention of a woman who had kept meticulous records for 18 years and was now reading them with a different question in mind. What she found confirmed what she had suspected. Money had been moving from their joint accounts into a separate vehicle, incrementally, in amounts that individually fell below reporting thresholds. Over 22 months, the total came to $78,000. He had been preparing an exit. He had been building it carefully, with the professional literacy of a man who managed other people's money for a living and understood how to move his own without leaving obvious traces. She opened a new folder on her laptop. She named it Ida, after her grandmother. Then, she made a single call. The attorney was a woman named Celestine Marsh, who had practiced estate and family law in Richmond for 27 years, and whose reputation in the professional community Vivienne had researched carefully before selecting her. They met at Celestine's office on Grove Avenue on a Thursday morning, and Vivienne brought the ledger and the photographed documents and the complete household financial record, going back 4 years. Celestine reviewed the materials without interrupting. When she finished, she removed her reading glasses and set them on the table. "The draft prenuptial agreement is interesting," she said, in the measured way of a person for whom interesting carries significant weight. "He had it prepared but never presented it to you. That tells you something about his intentions at that stage." "It tells me he decided the account was better hidden than protected," Vivienne said. Celestine nodded slowly. "The movement from the joint accounts is recoverable, with proper documentation, which you have. The undisclosed account is a separate question. Do you have any additional information about its current value?" "Not yet," Vivienne said. "But I will." Real power, her grandmother used to say, operated in quiet rooms. She visited her grandmother's house in Danville the following weekend, the last visit before the estate sale would begin to clear it. She walked through every room with the particular attention of a person taking an inventory they know they will not take again, noting the furniture, the photographs, the small accumulated objects of a long and careful life. In the kitchen, she ran her hand along the counter where she had sat as a child, doing homework. She stayed for 2 hours. Then she drove back to Richmond. On the drive, she called her grandmother's estate attorney, a man named William Tate, who had managed Ida Okafor's affairs for 16 years, and who had been the one to give Vivienne the safe deposit box key 18 months prior. She had one question. He answered it in 4 sentences. She sat with the answer for the remainder of the drive, and when she arrived home, she put the car in the garage and sat in the quiet of it for a full 3 minutes before she went inside. She now understood what the $1 meant. Her grandmother had spent 50 years appearing to live simply. She had earned modestly, spent modestly, and given generously to her church and her community. She had also, beginning in 1987, made a series of investments through a private vehicle established on her behalf by a family in Danville for whom she had worked. A family whose patriarch had recognized in Ida Okafor a quality of judgment he respected, and had offered to include her in a private investment partnership as consideration for 20 years of service. Ida had accepted. She had reinvested every distribution for 37 years. She had never spent $1 of it and had never told a living soul about it, except for Vivienne, on one afternoon 6 years ago, in the same kitchen where Vivienne had done her childhood homework. She had said, "There is something I am leaving you that no one will see coming. The dollar in the will is the instruction. When you hear it read, you will know it is time to go to the box." The safe deposit box held one document, a letter from William Tate and a certified account statement for a private investment account in the name of the Okafor Family Trust, of which Vivienne Annette Okafor Wade was the sole named beneficiary. Current value, $312 million. Vivienne sat in the bank's private room with the document in both hands and did not move for 4 minutes. She had spent 40 years watching her grandmother and had understood perhaps half of what there was to understand. The other half was in her hands now. She drove directly to Celestine's office and placed the document on the table and said nothing. Celestine looked at it for a long time. "Well," she said finally, "I think we can move forward." The estate reading was scheduled for 3 weeks from the day of the funeral. Celestine had reached out to William Tate and coordinated a sequenced disclosure. The standard will reading first, the trust documentation to be introduced immediately after, in the same room, with the same witnesses present. It was not standard practice. It was, in this case, precisely correct. Vivienne spent those 3 weeks attending to the details of her life with the orderly composure she had always brought to it. She went to work. She made dinner. She asked Desmond about his day. She wrote in the ledger every evening and watered the succulent on the kitchen sill, and said nothing about the safe deposit box or the trust or Celestine Marsh or any of it. She was performing the ordinary surface of her life. She was very good at it. Desmond had, in that same 3-week period, transferred an additional $11,000 from the joint account into the separate vehicle she was not supposed to know about. She documented it. She added it to the folder named Ida. She said nothing. Preparation was the work. The reading took place in William Tate's conference room on a Wednesday morning. Desmond wore the well-cut blazer. He sat beside Vivienne with the composed patience of a man who expects a small sum and has already decided how to respond to it. William read the standard bequests. The property, the jewelry, the charitable distributions, and then he said the $1, and Desmond laughed, and the laugh sat in the room for approximately 2 seconds before William Tate looked up from the document and said, "There is a second component to the estate, which I am required to present in sequence." He placed a new document on the table. Celestine, who had been seated quietly at the far end of the room in her capacity as Vivienne's personal counsel, opened her own portfolio. William walked through the trust, its establishment in 1987, its structure, its 37 years of compounded reinvestment, its sole named beneficiary. He stated the current value in the same unhurried tone he had used for every other figure in the reading: $312 million. The room was very quiet. Desmond's attorney, a man who had accompanied him to the reading without fully understanding why he had been invited, looked at his client, and then at the document, and then at Vivienne. Celestine then placed her own materials on the table: the $78,000 in documented transfers from the joint account, the draft prenuptial agreement, photographed cleanly with its date visible, a complete accounting of the undisclosed investment account, which Celestine had, through appropriate legal channels, obtained in discovery preparation. Desmond looked at the table for a long time. He tried. He said it had been a complicated period. He said the account was something he had maintained before their marriage and had not known how to introduce. He looked at Vivienne with an expression she recognized as the specific performance of sincerity in a man who had practiced it for years but had never actually felt it. His mother, who had come to the reading out of family custom and now sat 3 chairs to his left, said quietly and without turning to look at him, "Desmond, stop." He stopped. Vivienne looked at him across the table in the same steady way she had looked at the trust document in the bank's private room, fully, completely, without flinching. "You laughed," she said. "You heard my grandmother's name, and you heard a number, and you laughed. That is the thing I will remember. Not the account, not the transfers. That laugh. Because it told me everything I needed to know about what you thought this was." She stood. She gathered the Navy ledger from the table. She had brought it, as she brought it everywhere, and she looked at William Tate and said thank you. And she looked at Celestine and nodded once. And she walked out of the conference room and through the lobby and into the Richmond morning without looking back. Her grandmother had built for 37 years in absolute silence, and the dollar in the will was the instruction. And the instruction had arrived exactly when it was needed. 11 months later, Vivienne sat in the garden of a house she had purchased in the Fan district of Richmond, a restored Victorian on a tree-lined block whose kitchen she had renovated herself over the winter months, tile by careful tile, in the particular terracotta shade she had always associated with Danville soil. The clay dish from her old kitchen counter sat on the new windowsill, holding nothing now but a piece of sea glass she had found on a trip to the Virginia beach shore the previous summer. A man named James sat beside her in the garden, a landscape architect she had engaged to consult on the property's grounds, and who had, in the course of 4 professional conversations, demonstrated a quality of attention she recognized and valued. He listened to what she actually said, rather than to what he expected her to say. He was deliberate and unhurried, and did not perform for rooms. He had asked her to dinner by saying he found her company clarifying, which was the most accurate and most appealing thing anyone had said to her in a long time. The trust had been formally transferred and was under management. The Okafor Family Foundation, which Vivienne had established in her grandmother's name 2 months after the reading, had made its first round of grants to 4 organizations in the Danville area that Ida had supported quietly for decades. The foundation's inaugural report, which Vivienne had written herself, ran to 12 pages and began with a sentence from a woman who had spent 50 years appearing to live simply. A woman who makes herself small is not a woman who thinks small. Desmond Wade had settled. The joint account transfers were returned with interest. The undisclosed investment account had been addressed in the settlement agreement with the kind of specificity that Celestine had insisted upon, and that Desmond's attorney had ultimately accepted, because the alternative was considerably worse. He had left his firm under circumstances that people in the Richmond financial community described with the careful brevity of professionals who had decided not to associate themselves with the specifics. He was working in an advisory capacity for a smaller operation in the Northern Neck. His mother had not attended his most recent professional event, the woman whose name Vivienne had eventually confirmed. A colleague from his firm named Petra Cousins had transferred to a branch office in another state the previous spring. Vivienne had heard all of this through Celestine, who reported without editorializing. Vivienne received each piece of information with the same composure she brought to everything else, and did not follow any of the threads further. There was nothing to collect in that direction. James passed her a cup of tea without being asked, because he had been paying close enough attention to know she had set hers down 5 minutes ago, and it would be getting cold. The garden was beginning to come into its own, the beds she had planned over the winter, the roses along the back fence she had planted in April, the small, ornamental tree at the center that would be something significant in 10 years. She had chosen everything with the long view in mind, the way her grandmother had taught her, the way a woman thinks when she has learned not to confuse what is visible now with what is being built. The afternoon light moved across the garden in the particular way of October in Richmond, amber and precise and entirely without apology. Write everything down. The ones who keep the records are the ones who keep the truth. Vivienne had kept the records. She had the truth. She had this garden. She had all the time she needed to tend both. She was free. She was solvent. She was her grandmother's granddaughter, entirely and at last. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.